Hello and welcome to the Year 12 mind map for the adaptations of plants and animals. We will start with what an adaptation is, and so we will zoom in here. An adaptation is any feature that provides a selective advantage. There are three types of adaptations in your course. The first one is structural, which will be in red, physiological, which will be in blue, and behavioral, which will be in green. First of all, we will discuss thermoregulation. There are 5 terms you need to know for thermoregulation. The first is endotherm, which is a creature that creates its internal body heat through cellular respiration. Next is homeotherm, which maintains a relatively constant body temperature. Then we have heterotherms that regulate their temperature when active but not inactive. We have ectotherms that derive most of their body temperature from the environment. And we have poikilotherms whose body temperature mimics that of the environment. You can see that an endotherm is also a homeotherm because it maintains a constant body temperature, but an ectotherm is most likely a poikilotherm because its temperature mimics that of the environment. As the environmental temperature rises, its body temperature will also rise. Then we come down to endothermic animals in both hot conditions and cold conditions. In hot conditions, we have structural, physiological, and behavioral adaptations. A thermal window is a hairless area that allows radiation or evaporation. Kangaroos have thermal windows on their forearms. Light color reduces the absorption of solar radiation. Highly vascularized extremities allow heat loss by radiation and evaporation. They can have large extremities, which increase the exposure to the environment and increase heat loss. Vasodilation is the first physiological adaptation. This is where blood vessels dilate close to the skin to allow more heat loss out of the blood. Sweating is when a layer of water is put onto the surface and then heat allows the water to change phase, and when the water as a vapor leaves, it also takes the heat with it. Panting is the same as sweating, but it's on the tongue and nose. Licking thermal windows is like sweating, but it involves a kangaroo licking its forearms. Pylorelaxation is when the hairs lie flat on the skin and allows airflow to increase evaporation. Behavioral adaptations include being nocturnal, which means being active at night to avoid the heat of the day, and burrowing, which is going underground during the heat of the day to reduce the exposure to the sun. Adaptations to being cold. Thick fur acts as an insulator because it traps air close to the skin. Blubber is a great insulator and retains heat very close to the core of the body. Small extremities allow less opportunity for heat loss because it reduces the surface area to volume ratio. A spherical body lowers the surface area to volume ratio. Countercurrent exchange is when blood vessels carrying hot blood leaving the body transfers its heat to the veins which are returning to the body, reducing the amount of heat lost. Increasing your metabolism increases the amount of cellular respiration and thereby heat production. Vasoconstriction is the constriction of blood vessels away from the surface, taking the hot blood towards the core of the body. Shivering is a forced skeletal contraction of about 20 Hz that generates heat by friction. Piloerection is goosebumps to trap air close to the skin, and it acts as an insulator. Hibernation is when an organism goes underneath the ground to avoid the cold environment. Torpor is a condition with a reduced metabolism just above basal levels and allows the organism to use its fat stores that it gained over summer. Diurnal behavior, only active during the day so that it can access solar radiation, and it avoids activity in the cold of night. Brown fat is fat with extra mitochondria that can be used for thermogenesis. Dark colors allow for the absorption of more solar radiation from the sun, and huddling is a group activity that reduces the surface area to volume ratio of the group, reducing exposure to the environment. Then we get to ectothermic animals that use behavior for the most part to regulate their temperature. They're only active in warm and hot conditions as they get too slow in the cold. They gain and lose heat to the environment according to the temperature gradient, which is when heat will travel from a high temperature to a low temperature. Bumblebees can flap their wings to generate heat. Some organisms can slightly increase their metabolism to increase heat production. Again, dark colors increase absorption of solar radiation. Basking allows the organism to soak up solar radiation and increase its body temperature. Some organisms move to a hot medium, like snakes lying on a hot road. Other organisms in winter, they burrow to avoid exposure to the cold environment. And when they're in the burrow, a lot of them hibernate during winter. Next, we'll talk about the advantages of endothermy. An endotherm's metabolic rate is always at an optimum temperature, allowing for its enzymes to work at their optimum temperature. They are less susceptible to environmental variation, which means they can live in a wider range of environments. They can sustain high levels of activity all year round, including at night and in winter, which means they can hunt at all times. It also means that they can respond quickly to stimuli, and their higher body temperatures may deter pathogens. Next is xerophytic plants, and there are two types of adaptations. There are stomatal adaptations and structural adaptations. Small leaves means a reduced amount of stomata, which means less transpiration. Spikes instead of leaves means no stomata at all, and therefore no transpiration. A reduced number of leaves, again, less stomata, less transpiration. Hairy leaves is like piloerection, trapping a layer of air next to the surface of the leaf to reduce the osmotic gradient. Rolled leaves create a humoral chamber next to the stomata to reduce transpiration. Abscission means the dropping of leaves in winter to reduce water loss. A thick waxy cuticle stops evaporation from between epidermal cells. Fibrous roots have a high surface area to volume ratio close to the surface to rapidly absorb any water when available, like when it's raining or there is dew on the ground. Deep taproot accesses the water table constantly. Heat shock proteins are found in a lot of cells, and these heat shock proteins denature instead of the essential enzymes that would lead to death. Leaf size, shape, color, and surface area to volume ratio all affect the level of transpiration. And vertical leaves, like those of eucalypts, expose less surface area to the sun and therefore reduce the amount of transpiration. Stomatal adaptations include stomata on the underside of the leaf so they're not exposed directly to the sun. Sunken stomata in stomatal crypts to create a humid chamber. Trichomes, which are the hairs found around stomata that trap air to reduce transpiration. Stomata opening during the day increases transpiration and therefore evaporative cooling. Stomata closed during midday avoids excessive transpiration in the hottest part of the day. Stomata open at night for cam plants allows for gas exchange but avoids the heat in deserts and therefore unnecessary transpiration. And again, leaves have less stomata. Here is a xerophyte. And you can see several features like rolled leaf, sunken stomata, trichomes, etc. Now we're going to water and ions, and we'll start with halophytes. Here is a picture of a mangrove and its adaptations. Mangroves and saltbush are very good halophytic plants to put into your answers, and they have a number of physiological and 2 structural adaptations. They can store salt in vacuoles in the roots to take the salt out of the cytoplasm to avoid its toxic effects, but still creates a higher osmotic potential and drawing water into the roots. They accumulate salt in old leaves that then undergoes abscission, taking the salt with it. It can store salt in vacuoles to inhibit salt from interfering with cell functions. They can store salt in succulent tissues to dilute the salt concentration. They have a waxy membrane that prevents salt entering the root but still allowing water in. They have active transport of salt straight out of the roots as soon as it enters, and it has salt glands on leaves to pump salt directly onto the surface of the leaf, and this salt also works to reflect the heat. All right, next we come to terrestrial animals for the most part, and we get to water, where there are 2 structural and 2 physiological adaptations. The first structural is the long loop of Henle that absorbs more water from the filtrate. The desert hopping mouse has the longest loop of Henle for its body size. The next is the release of antidiuretic hormone from the posterior pituitary, which inserts aquaporins into the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct. This allows for more water to be reabsorbed out of the urine. Camels also store fat in their hump, and the adipose tissue stores a lot of water, and the adipose tissue, when it breaks down, releases a lot of metabolic water. And so the last one here is metabolic water, which is when water is produced as a byproduct of carbohydrate and lipid metabolism. Then we get onto nitrogenous wastes, which is a very good place for it because it aligns perfectly with water use. First is ammonia, which is very, very toxic. It is produced by the deamination of proteins. As I said, it's very toxic and can't be stored. It requires lots of water to excrete, and it's only excreted by fish, which aren't terrestrial, but you get that. Next we have urea. Mammals react ammonia with carbon dioxide in the liver to make the urea. It's mildly toxic and can be stored for short periods. It requires some water to excrete and is excreted by mammals. The last type of nitrogenous waste that you need to know is uric acid. It's created by an energy-intensive process, which is one of the drawbacks. It's non-toxic and can be stored for long periods of time, like in the eggs of reptiles and birds. It's excreted as a paste, so no water is required, and as I've said, it's excreted by reptiles and birds. Then we get to aquatic animals, and we're dealing mainly with fish here. A freshwater fish gains water from its environment through osmosis. It does not need to drink the water. It does lose salt through diffusion, but it can't help that. It has mitochondrial-rich cells in its gills to actively take up ions from the water. It has simple nephrons that do not absorb water. Ions are pumped into the cells, but prevents water from doing so. The nephrons actively reabsorb salt from the filtrate. They produce large volumes of very dilute urine, and they have scales that reduce the amount of surface area exposed to the fresh water. Marine fish lose water to the environment via osmosis, therefore they need to drink the seawater. They have secretory cells in their guts that actively absorb their ions, thus increasing obligatory osmosis. They have chloride secretory cells that pump ions back into the water. They have sodium-potassium pumps in their gills to pump the salt back into the water. Some of them make trimethylamine that requires much less water to excrete than ammonia. Their nephrons reabsorb a lot of water from the filtrate, and they produce a small volume of urine that is highly concentrated. And an interesting fact is that some mammals can reabsorb water through their rectum. Next we have euryhaline organisms that can survive a wide range of salinities. These organisms are the bull sharks, the salmon, and the green crabs. All of them spend some proportion of their life in either freshwater or marine environments. They modulate the osmolarity of their blood by retaining urea without damaging their cells. In the marine environment, they store urea. In freshwater, they excrete urea. Here we have some figures. The freshwater osmolarity is 3.2 millimoles per litre, and the euryhaline blood osmolarity is 640. But when they get into the marine environment, the seawater osmolarity is 708 millimoles per litre, and the euryhaline blood osmolarity is 800. Therefore, it's still hypertonic, drawing in water through osmosis. Okay. Thank you for listening, and I will see you later.